All right, let's journey back in time to a really pivotal moment in ancient Indian history. We're talking about an era of massive change, where you see these scattered tribes beginning to coalesce into mighty empires. Today, we're diving deep into that period, the time of the 16 Mahajanapadas. This all happened between roughly 600 and 322 BCE, and it wasn't just about new kingdoms popping up. This was the birth of India's very first great states. But you've got to wonder, right? How does a shift that massive even happen? What was the spark that took a whole landscape of small, scattered tribes and transformed it into a network of powerful, competing kingdoms and republics? Well, it turns out the answer lies in a revolution that completely reshaped the foundations of society. And that answer has a name. Historians call it the second urbanization. You see, after the incredible cities of the Indus Valley civilization declined, there was this huge resurgence. Cities started booming again, trade networks exploded, and totally new political structures began to form. This period, this second urbanization, really set the stage for everything that was to come.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the piece of technology that kickstarted everything. Then, we'll dive into the different kinds of governments that were competing for power. After that, we'll get a feel for what daily life was like, check out a huge spiritual revolution, and finally, we'll see how one superpower, Magadha, rose to dominate them all.
Okay, first up, the Iron Age catalyst. And this is so cool because this whole transformation wasn't just driven by new ideas or politics. At its core, it was powered by a single, game-changing metal. Think of it like a chain reaction. The first domino was the widespread use of iron tools, things like iron plows and sturdy axes. This was an absolute game changer. For the first time, people could clear the super dense forests of the Gangetic Plains, opening up incredibly fertile land for farming. This led to a huge boom in agriculture, creating something that was pretty rare before, a massive food surplus. And with extra food, you can support people who aren't farmers, like soldiers, craftsmen, and rulers. And that leads directly to the growth of towns, then cities, and finally, the huge states we call the Mahajanapadas.
So, with this new economic engine humming, new political systems started to take shape. But here's the interesting part. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all situation. The political landscape was this dynamic arena of competing states, and they were governed in two very different ways.
Now, thanks to ancient texts, especially Buddhist sources like the Anguttara Nikaya, we know the magic number. The whole area was dominated by 16 major states. And these weren't just kingdoms. They were Mahajanapadas, a word that literally means great realms. And just look at the spread of these states. It's really staggering. We're talking from Gandhara and Cambodia, way out in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, all the way down to Asuka in the south, and then all across the Gangetic Plain, with heavy hitters like Magadha, Kashi, and Kosala. This was the political world stage of the 6th century BCE. So in this big political arena, there were two competing models. On one side, you had the monarchies, like Magadha. These were run by a king whose son would take over, and he had pretty much absolute power. Their main goal? Expansion. On the other side, you had something totally different, the republics, also known as Ganasangas, like Vaji. These were run by a council of chiefs, so power was more spread out. They were more focused on defense, and, this is key, their culture was way more open to new ideas and freedom of thought. Okay, so that's the high-level politics. But what was life actually like for the people living in these states? Let's zoom in a bit and look at the society and the economy of the time. Life was changing, and fast. The caste system was becoming much more defined and rigid, really locking in social hierarchies. The towns were buzzing with energy. They weren't just government centers, they were major hubs for trade, with powerful guilds of craftsmen and merchants basically running the commercial scene. Out in the countryside, rice was king, fueling this whole new economy. And for most folks, home was a simple house made of mud brick and wood. And of course, with organized states come, you guessed it, organized taxes. The standard rate for a farmer was 1/6 of their total harvest. Royal agents would come and collect it directly, and this tax revenue was the economic engine that paid for the armies, the officials, and the grand cities of the Mahajanapadas. Now, when everything in society is in upheaval, your government, your economy, where you live, it's only natural that the way people think about the big spiritual questions also starts to change. This era sparked a profound spiritual revolution with new ideas that directly challenged the old, established traditions. This quote really gets to the heart of it.
There's a powerful argument that the political atmosphere in those republics, the Ganasangas, created the perfect environment for new philosophies to grow. In those states, you could actually question authority and debate new ideas. That freedom of expression was like fertile soil for thinkers. And out of this incredible intellectual energy came two movements that would change the world: Buddhism and Jainism. And it's probably no accident that their founders, Gautama Buddha and Mahavira, were both from the kshatriya, or warrior class. They were, in a way, challenging the traditional spiritual monopoly held by the Brahmana priests. So why did these new ideas catch on so quickly? Well, they were offering something totally different. They pushed back against complicated and expensive rituals. They questioned the idea that Brahmanas were automatically at the top. They spoke to people in everyday languages like Pali and Prakrit, not the elite Sanskrit. They really appealed to the growing merchant class. And their focus on nonviolence, or ahimsa, even had a practical economic benefit. It helped protect the cattle that were so vital for farming. So you have this grand chessboard with 16 powerful players, all making moves, forming alliances, and fighting for an edge. But over time, one player started to outthink and outmaneuver everyone else, slowly positioning itself to take over the whole board. This is the story of how that empire was forged. So the biggest question of the day became pretty clear. Out of these 16 powerful states, who was going to come out on top? Which one had what it took to conquer the others and build the subcontinent's very first great empire? The answer was Magadha. And this was no fluke. Magadha basically had a perfect storm of advantages. Geographically, it sat on super fertile land with control of key river highways. Economically, it had access to massive iron ore deposits, which meant better weapons and tools. Militarily, they were the first to use elephants in their army on a huge scale. Think of them as ancient tanks. And politically, they just had a string of incredibly ambitious and ruthless rulers who knew how to. Now, this empire wasn't built in a day. It happened over generations. First, the Haryanka dynasty got the ball rolling. Then, the Shishunaga dynasty took out their biggest rival, Avanti. This all led up to the Nanda dynasty, which, under Mahapadmananda, created a truly massive empire. And it was this Nanda empire that a young man named Chandragupta Maurya would overthrow, using its foundations to build the even more famous Mauryan Empire. So, in the end, the era of the 16 competing Mahajanapads was over. One superpower, Magadha, had won. But the legacy of that competitive period is just undeniable. It didn't just disappear, it evolved. It laid the entire political, economic, and even philosophical groundwork for the great classical age of India that followed. And that leaves us with one last fascinating question to think about. We saw two different ways of ruling, the monarchy and the republic. History tells us the monarchy won. But just imagine for a second, what if it had gone the other way? How different would the story of India be if a republic with its culture of debate and shared power had been the one to unite the subcontinent?